Everyone, welcome to the webinar on why L&D consolidation is no longer optional. I'm joining with my partner here, Rob Lauber. We're excited to be here. Thank you all for joining. We have some people coming in right now. We know that kind of at the end of the hour, we have a lot of people leaving one meeting and joining the other. So we'll get started here in just a second. Thank you, everybody, for joining this session. While people are joining in, just a little bit of housekeeping. This is Microsoft Teams platform. It's really easy to collaborate. You can either ask a question through a Q&A panel. You should have a little window at the top or the side that says Q&A. You can write a question there and we'll answer that along the way. You can also utilize chat. It's a really easy way as well. I'm just going to say welcome to the webinar in the chat so that you can see where that pops up. Encourage you to use that. Rob and I want this webinar to be really conversational. We're talking about a fairly strategic topic here, and I know one that has a lot of nuance. I feel like the more strategic a conversation is, the more answers you get of, well, it depends, which usually means it requires a longer conversation. So encourage you all to leverage the chat if you have any questions. With that, we'll go ahead and get underway because we're now just 3 minutes past the hour. One final thing, you will get the recording of this as well sent to you in a couple days after the event. So don't worry about frantically taking notes. We will send you the recording. Before I pass over to Rob, I will do just a brief intro. I'm Nolan Hout, been in the L&D industry for about 14 years. I host a podcast where I interview several different leaders in the L&D space on various topics. And Rob is one of those topics as well. For Infopro Learning, the company I work with, really what I focus is on driving our new products and our new solutions, whether that be strategy, AI, whatever it is. And for those of you who are not aware of Infopro Learning, we're a professional consulting organization really focused on large-scale talent transformations. With that, I'm going to pass it over to Rob to introduce himself and to get us started with the webinar, but I'll be here working with Rob in the background along the way.
Hey, thanks, Nolan, and hi, everybody. Yeah. Thanks for joining us today. Excited to be here. I'm Rob Lauber. I think this is year 36 in learning and development, Nolan, so kind of scary, from pre-internet days, if you can believe that. So now we're talking about AI, which is sort of post-internet days. So anyway, very excited to be here today. I think Nolan's right around the subject that we're going to talk about today around sort of consolidation and how you think about how you run your learning functions inside your business. Always controversial, seems like always in pursuit. The centralized, decentralized, federated conversation, I think, has been going on forever. Chasing ROI goes back to at least the 1960s. So I expect that this conversation today will be one of those as well, where you might not get answers, but I think you might get some insights in terms of, mental models and ways to think differently about what consolidation means, or even, why to even think about consolidation in terms of where it goes. So I'm going to share a few slides and walk through, and Nolan's going to chime in as well and keep me honest here. And, we'll kind of take your questions on the fly as well. So please, actively use the chat and, let's make it a good conversation as we go. So, all right, so here we go. Test my skills here. So hopefully you can see this slide here, but basically today's topic, why L&D consolidation is no longer optional, is really talking about how managed learning services can help you on efficiency and effectiveness as well. So really I'm going to talk about first the case about why learning and development consolidation is even matters. So got a lot of text on this slide, but I think you'll see in the playback as well. You can take some good notes out of this, but more and more organizations really face a lot of pressure to, you'll hear lots of words thrown around like modernize, streamline, be more efficient, be more effective, demonstrate impact, those types of pieces. A huge amount of pressure, particularly coming out of COVID, for organizations to really hit on all three of these things in terms of modernizing, streamlining, and demonstrating impact. So, and a lot of that is the result of people seeing, for example, escalating costs rising across disconnected systems, or challenges in tracking the actual activity in terms of what's actually going on, to inconsistent learner experiences, and I'll talk a little bit about those, and then reduced agility in responding to business needs. So I'm going to talk a little bit about each of those in more substance here as we go through. So let's
When we
talk
look at
about,
when
go
we
ahead.
look at this, why it matters, would you say that it matters more, less, or like the same as it always has?
I think it's starting to matter more because strategically organizations are asking how they can get their hands around some of the issues that they're facing that's going on. So,
Right.
as we talk, for example, what they're seeing in the organization from a learning function, like this first one around fragmentation, for example, um, frustrates a lot of organizations. And depending on how you're structured, you can see these examples, like in a decentralized organization, for example. It's not uncommon to run into a lot of siloed initiatives, and it's not uncommon to see budget fragmentation. I was working with a client a few months ago, and the question was, well, how much do you spend across the enterprise on training, your people, and what's your investment level look like per person? Have no idea. It's so
Mm.
fragmented and so dispersed. One a bit of a surprise question, I guess, in the conversation, and then two, the level of effort and the lens at which they look at their organization wasn't that way. But once the question was asked, it became like an important question for them to try to figure out the answer to. Right. And so a lot of that was really around, seeing siloed initiatives and seeing duplicative efforts, was really around like, well, then, we've got budget fragmentation on top of that. So we're spending to solve the same problems in multiple places across our organization. So I think if you're the CFO, or you're sitting at a senior level in the organization where you see these duplicated efforts happening or these silos happening, it becomes really challenging for you or frustrating for you in the organization. If you want to push things across the entire organization, suddenly you have either 5 teams solving for the same thing, or you have to suddenly work through multiple levels of bureaucracy to get the same message out to different audiences.
Yeah, and I think, when you speak of, is this a now problem, a later problem, whatever, the interesting component that I see now is it with tools and the automation happening, there is more and more people, it seems like, trying to go after the same thing, right? You have companies like an Eightfold who are going after the head of marketing, saying, "Don't you want to map the skills across your marketing team better and promote better and hire better?" Well, at the same time, HR is being advertised saying, "Don't you want to map skills across the entire organization?" While at the same time, L&D is being marketed to by Eightfold saying, "Don't you want to improve the skills of your organization?" So these tools are now, like, not that the tools are creating the problem, but I think they are so they've made the problem or the solution more obtainable,
Yeah.
or seemingly more obtainable. And so more people are trying to solve this problem with this quick win or this quick shortcut or whatever it is. And so it's pulling us all in disparate in different areas, for
Yeah.
sure.
Yeah. I think, to your point, and not picking on Eightfold for sure, but
No,
the,
it's
the,
not.
the distraction of solutions,
Yes.
right, as opposed to the focus on problems you're trying to solve, is
Yeah.
real in organizations. And so, if you've been in learning and development for 10 minutes, you know that, every solution can be solved with more training, right? As opposed to stepping back and systematically looking at what's really driving the problem and is it even worth solving? And I think you see that in, to your point, like marketing organizations sitting there and working in a silo, for example, are going to sit there and try to solve their talent problems within marketing the way that they think it makes sense.
Mhm.
And oftentimes, you'll run across a solution provider who will say, I have the hammer, I'll
Yeah.
find all your nails and we'll bang them all into the ground, even though they're really screws, or they're, they're wooden pegs. Right. And so, So I think there's a bit of a problem there that's, an age-old problem, and that is people are selling solutions into organizations without really defining problems.
Totally.
I think that, fragmentation exacerbates that, right? Because the outcome is you've
Yes.
got, we'll pick on eightfold again. You got eightfold in one place, you got Fuel 50 in another place, and then you suddenly have the, I don't know, Workday Skills Cloud in some other function in the organization. And that creates, probably all three of these issues that I'm laying here in terms of fragmentation and inefficiency in the organization. So now I'm in marketing and I move over to HR, hypothetically. Let's say that happened. All my data that's sitting in one fragmented place can't move to another fragmented place. So it creates all kinds of challenges from an organizational perspective. And then I'll talk a little bit also about the learner perspective as well.
Yeah,
So,
absolutely agree.
so I think, you're spot on that that's part of the issue that organizations need to work through and help figure out. There's also greater demand for consistent learner experience. I talked a little bit about this as well, but in the example I just gave, for example, multiple logins, multiple interfaces, different formats and approaches, and even user interfaces for e-learning content vary from supplier to supplier and from department to department in decentralized organizations. And so, compliance training doesn't look anything like my functional training because it's managed by two different organizations in the company. Or, or the catalogs organized by someone in IT who's really thinking about, sort of data access as opposed to user access. And as a consequence, right, I have to go searching through my one company I know of had 200,000 courses in their catalog, right? So how do you find what's actually relevant to me? And it was a consequence basically of a fragmented, siloed organization that sit out there. So, and then this third one you kind of talked about in sort of the skills piece, but also making that connection into what career development actually looks like. And when you've got different approaches and different experiences, is super hard strategically at the organization to really figure out how well is that working and does that really matter, which we know it does from a retention and performance perspective, but really how do we point out ways that people can develop and explore what career pathways are available to them if they can only see what's within their function.
Yeah, and it's interesting you mentioned the demand for consistent learner experience. I think, there were surveys and you even have a stat on here that talks about, 78% of employees say they would stay if they saw a clear career development path. And I think the word clear is probably the word that gets overlooked the most.
Sure.
You mentioned the company has 200,000 things. I bet if you surveyed that company, the employees would say, I would stick around if I was offered more training programs, right? And the L&D person is like, well, I guess we need 2,500 then, because we just simply don't have enough.
Yeah.
When the reality is that this has been the demand for our engagement and a person's engagement has never been higher. There are more things to distract us than there ever have been, and there are things designed to distract us. And if you look at a learning program, it is jarring if you go from one brand to the next, meaning within the same company, right? Okay, I got onboarded and I'm in the Coca-Cola marketing department, and oh, this is really flashy. Oh, but then now I'm taking the skills training program and it looks like it was developed 100 years ago. That doesn't really match up for me. Oh, my Instagram. Taylor Swift just got engaged. That's interesting. Let me now dig down a hole on that. So I think that becomes really key is what we're seeing, and I think you're seeing as well, Rob, is there's no real lack of content. There's no lack of learning information out there, but how are we making that clear to our employees of what they want to take, what they need to take, and then clear that this is all coming from the same unified goal, as you mentioned, to develop your career.
Yeah. And I think, in the first sort of sentence I put up in the slide is there's a growing expectation that, the things I access outside of work behave the same
Yeah.
similarly to the things I access inside of work. So, I'll just use a simple example. if my learning management system is not app friendly, although most are today, but not all, if it's not app friendly, today's workers entering the workforce are going to be like, seriously, I can only access this on my laptop, right? That makes no sense at all, right? So the consumer grade sort of experience on content, the way it's designed, the way it's approached, and the way it looks and feels, there's almost an expectation there as well on that front, which creates, again, sort of learner experience disconnects between what they expect and what they actually get. So
Speaking of disconnects, Rob, not to call anything out, but did you create this image using AI? I just noticed that this lady has three hands.
I did. I know. She's got three hands and seamless is spelled wrong. So you'll see that in multiple, yeah, in multiple of these. The great news is it gave me a great theme. The bad news is, in spite of my reprompting to fix the image, this is as close as I could get. So yeah, three hands, good call there. So you might, there's some more Easter eggs like that buried within this
Yeah, so let's see
presentation
if we
as
can
well.
spot them all.
There you go. We'll go on to this one then too, where there's not really numbers, but at least it spells learning right. So, there's also, the back to consolidation, there's also a lot of pressure to demonstrate business impact. And I think most leaders in learning and development, particularly coming out of COVID, um, enjoyed a moment, I would say, where it was just do whatever it takes to keep people engaged. And the boomerang back on that in 23 and 24 budget cycles was really about, let's get back to demonstrate business impact, right? Let's get back to business. Let's get back to sort of what matters most. Even some of the return to office, pieces, not to distract into a different direction, but a lot of it's sort of a pressure to return to business.
Yeah.
And the scrutiny levels that we experienced in the 2015 to 2020 arena aren't really different than the scrutiny levels that people are getting right now. The difference is that it feels like a contraction because we had this sort of inflated expansion of what we could do from an L&D perspective. So it was, just make sure people have access to content. We went out, we bought a LinkedIn Learning catalog. We made it available to all our employees. We declared victory. We promoted people to go out and use it. They used a heck of a lot of it while we were sort of waiting for COVID to get figured out and for us to get back to work. And then suddenly in 2023, we find we're spending $100,000 a year on a LinkedIn Learning contract and 12 people are using it. Like, what are we doing, right? And so, it's always hard for us it's easy for us to add, it's always hard for us to contract. And so asking the questions about, what's the impact that this is actually happening? Why are we actually doing it? And it doesn't necessarily, clear ROI metrics. I'd actually argue with myself about putting that in a bullet point because I don't think that they necessarily demand ROI metrics. They'll demand ROI metrics on things that we're already doing that they don't see value in. But if we tie the value that we're trying to drive on the front end of it, then the ROI metric kind of goes away. But business impact is the important word. It's tied to a specific, business impact that we're going after. It might be cultural. It might be, we're trying to build everyone's AI, comfort and capability, right? Are you really going to get ROI on that? Yeah, maybe, but maybe it's not that important as long as you're seeing people beginning to use the tools, right? So being clear really about the impact that you're expecting is really important. But there's challenges there around, in decentralized systems, siloed systems, data fragmentations all over the place. So how do what works in marketing? How do you know if that actually is true in HR? How do you know if that's true in IT? How do you know if that's true in sales? If you've got disparate functions and data paths and programs that actually, try to solve the same thing. And then, alignment becomes really challenging as well because business leaders do struggle to connect those activities to what the business is trying to accomplish. So there's an elevation lately, especially around scrutiny in terms of sort of being able to drive a straight line between what the business is trying to do and what the learning functions are trying to do. And in sort of decentralized, fragmented organizations, it's not uncommon for organizations to sit there and say, well, they're serving the needs of my sales organization, really well because, I have these team of people under me as the VP of sales that are delivering sales training to my people.
Hmm.
So I can sit there and say, well, they are, but at an organizational strategic priority perspective, maybe they're not. Right. So I was just in a conversation with somebody last week who was talking to me about how important refresher training is, for example. And they're a functional leader and they're driving, they've got training responsibility underneath them. And they're talking about, how we do a lot of refresher training because people forget the first time that we did it.
Hmm.
Right. And, and you sit there and you say, interesting. And,
Yeah.
I can see that. But, my guess is that those programs are probably not connected to strategic business priorities, or the business priorities aren't explicitly reinforced with people that those are the priorities, or you wouldn't need to refresh because people would be doing, right? So it's some interesting sort of things that you're seeing there
How do
around the pressure
you
to drive impact.
how do you manage some of that though, right? You're in L&D, and I know we talk a little bit about like the, how you can help later on, but when you have these functions like marketing, sales, whatever it is, going out and saying, I want to I want to implement this new sales methodology or whatever. How do you kind of support them? Like, how do you wrap your arms around that and have some influence, um, so that you understand and how it ties into everything? But obviously, a lot of times the way those organizations are structured, you're not really structured to like even have a budget control of where they spend their training.
Yeah, for sure. I think the conversation's really around the front end of that and how you define what success looks like.
Right. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So, sometimes success is just getting everyone through a program.
Yeah.
Right. Your stakeholder might just define that as, I want everyone to go through the new sales methodology and I want to make sure that they basically understand the sales methodology.
Hmm.
Okay. If that's what success looks like, that's pretty easy to do, pretty easy to measure, right? I can put a quiz in there and
Yeah.
people understand the new 4-step from the old 7-step selling process that we have. Okay, great. If that's how you want to define success, then great. That's what I'll measure in terms of defining success. Other more sophisticated conversations, though, oftentimes require you understand what the baseline is of data that you're working from, right? And how you're going to
Hmm.
define success going forward should be off the baseline of what currently is. And I've been several times across my career, I've been in those conversations about, well, let's talk about where we are right now on that. And the answer is, well, we don't really know. Right. And so then it's a conversation about, great, so how do we know what needle we're moving here?
Yeah.
Right. And I'm going to take sales is always a fun one. I'm going to take people out of the cycle of selling to put them through some training programs, an hour a day, a week, whatever it might be. I'm taking people away from selling to move a needle that we're not even sure either exists or that we don't know. We should probably try to be more explicit about what it is we're actually trying to change and figure out how we can measure where we are today against where we believe we should be in the future. And sometimes that's delayed training and put it off for a little while because the organization's actually not really sure what it is that they're actually asking for to change.
Yeah. Totally. I've seen that happen so many times.
And that's okay, right? But I think in the overall bigger picture around demonstrating business impact, the segmentation and the siloing sometimes creates problems around this because it's done in so many different ways.
Do you think
And
do
and
you
it
think
doesn't
that's
tie
an
up to.
do you think that's an opportunity to kind of de-silo, unify? I don't know if de-silo is a word, but like wrap your arms around that and to ask that tough question of like, hey, I heard that you're doing this great training program in sales on going from a 7-step to a 4-step. What do you hope to achieve at the end of that? Oh, we want people to know about it. Okay, well, if they know about it, what will happen? Will they like sell more or lose more deals? Like or the
Right.
closure rate will go lower? Like, what is it? Oh, well, this like so. Do you feel that sometimes? And actually, I was just I don't know if you know. Gosh, I just did it. The Teresa Zeller, the old CLO at
Uh-huh.
Merck.
Uh-huh.
just did the webinar with her, and I just posted it yesterday actually. And she's like, I think sometimes in L&D we lose sight that we're performance consultants, like first and foremost, and business consultants that happen to do learning. And so that kind of like comes to my mind of playing that role of a performance consultant actually gives you that ability to de-silo learning a bit more. If you are always the person saying, if you want to develop training, have at it, but let us make sure that it has a means to an end. And so now you
Correct.
become, that star of the show.
Yeah, I think, I think that's where I'm trying to go with it when I say like, are you front
Yeah.
end identifying what
Yeah. Yeah.
success
Yeah.
actually looks like? Is there a way to,
For
how do you
sure.
measure that? How do you measure that today? How will you,
Hmm.
will we measure it the same way afterwards at an organizational level, as opposed to pre and post testing individuals? I mean, maybe that's a tactic, but in a bigger picture way, like how, does the 7 step to the 4 step lead to more sales? Right?
Hmm.
Assuming that's the expectation, or shortens the sales cycle, or something organizations likely have measurements around today. I think that's absolutely right. You should be moving the conversation towards what's the performance gap and how do you know that training is actually going to solve the problem? Right,
Yep.
without saying, look, I'm not a learning and development guy, I'm a performance consultant. Right, you'll instantly lose every functional leader in the organization with that kind of conversation. but i think
Yeah.
but i think instead, well, let's talk about what success is. I used to, some people that were super smart but less sophisticated about it, I basically said, look, how are you going to evaluate whether I delivered for you or not?
Yeah.
Right, and then you would take them into the conversation about the performance and the business that you really wanted to move. And oftentimes I would sit there and have conversations that say, well, I'm not the only one that probably needs to be at the table for this. Then what's the communications plan? What
Yeah.
about rewards and compensation? What about, are we hiring the right kind of people that can be successful with the new measures? Those kind of conversations as well, that help them then think about it systemically beyond sort of the training request.
Yep.
So I think oftentimes where you've got a decentralized organization, you have people with a lot of functional expertise, lacking sort of that
True.
performance mindset, right?
Yeah.
And all super well intentioned and super respected in their businesses, and and have super clever ways of solving problems and those kind of things, but don't really have sort of the overarching business impact, business
Hmm.
strategy mindset and how they approach that. So I'll move on to this one and talk about, I talked a little bit about it earlier in terms of the user and learner experience, but I also think that the technological proliferation is creating complexity as well. So Gardner, I think this is from, says the average enterprise uses 13 plus different learning technologies. Now we can get into big debate about like, how do you define a learning technology, right? Because I'll define Teams as a learning technology if we really want to get down to it. That's how I learn from others in the organization. So, but it creates a complex ecosystem for organizations and creates complexity for organizations to figure it out. And you can think of the traditional sort of easy ones in fragmented organizations where you've got multiple LMSs. Like at McDonald's, I think we had somewhere between 10 and 13, depending on how you wanted to count it, LMSs when I started there. But we only have one email system. So, interesting parallels from that perspective. The maintenance overhead and those kind of pieces are all um, great conversations when you start talking to finance, when you start talking to CIOs, when you start talking to sort of the recipients of these things, in terms of either they get the bill for these 13 different platforms, or or they got to maintain these 13 different platforms. I think the other thing to consider is it makes it infinitely complicated for learning and development functions as well, because okay, we're going to teach the new 4-step selling process. How are we going to do that? I have 13 different platforms potentially that I have to deliver it across, or how do I pick the right one, to actually do it? And I think that it just creates a lot of administrative burden, adds a lot of unnecessary cost, and creates things, and basically creates complexity that doesn't need to be in systems,
Yeah,
Like,
I wonder how much of this is like the, cart or the tail wagging the dog kind of thing. Because I've been in these conversations and they've said like, well, okay, when it comes to we're creating this program, now we got to worry about how are we going to launch it. And it's like, well, if we go with, I don't know, like Cornerstone, it's going to be like this, and HR kind of owns that, so we're not going to be able to do anything with that. Now we could use this Lightcat, or whatever Edcast solution, but that's mostly good for video content. This is going to need to be a little bit of both. So what should we do? Well, let's get a 14th learning platform because it does exactly what we need. So it's almost like when you do create, like the technology sprawl creates challenges, which the answer is just to sprawl more.
sure.
Almost.
Well,
So,
take, like LMS, LXP, um, skills inventory
yeah,
platforms, skills
yeah,
management platforms, talent acquisition platforms, and career and succession planning platforms across organizations, and then throw in a bit of AI, right? So, sprinkle it across all of them, or in most organizations today, it's still sort of, use Copilot or use
yeah,
ChatGPT or use whatever completely separate learning tool, arguably, right? It just gets nuts. How do you actually figure out how these things, one, how data moves across, two, how these things actually come and work together, recognizing that your LXP probably exists because you didn't like your LMS interface, not because it
hmm,
actually drove incredible business value, right? A lot of those things get really challenging and actually just create more complexity for you in the learning function. Whether you're centralized or not, it creates complexity. And, back to that learner experience, it's a real struggle to drive consistency across all these things. So
totally.
efficiency wise, your ability to be efficient as a learning function gets really challenging in this space without any like good governance. I think it becomes a real challenge.
Yep.
So the other one, though I think this is the last one that I have, is also sort of globalization and agility needs, right? And so, and I can speak to the globalization piece, and it might not be applicable to everybody watching this or participating here. Like if you don't have a global organization, then you might say, well, that doesn't really matter to me. But agility certainly matters. Right? Every organization's being asked to move faster, move leaner, pivot, right? In whatever direction to keep up with whatever happens to be going on wherever they happen to be in their sector. So I think that these speed, scale, and agility pieces really become challenging for organizations when they're fractured and fragmented. The ability to move across functions simply to take a simple example like train everyone on compliance, right, can be challenging, right? Because decentralized organizations might get very proprietary about, no, we want everybody going through this platform. It's like, okay, now I got to disperse my sexual harassment training across 7 different platforms, right? So your speed and your agility get slowed down by those choices that you make. The other one is around recognizing globalization as well. And that is, can you get work done elsewhere that can be used, in lower cost markets that can be used in higher cost markets? Or also consolidation back to duplication of effort. Like at McDonald's, we found that, we had initiatives that were going on and there were 7 different markets that were working on the same thing at the same time,
Hmm.
literally all independently trying to solve the same problems. And when we first came together as a community, a global community, people were introducing themselves to others who had been in the same roles for 10 years that were, hundreds of miles apart geographically, but had never actually met each other or worked together.
Hmm.
So thinking about speed, scale, and agility, it's like I can have twice as many people solve, I can have the same number of people solve twice as many problems, just simply by communicating more openly, working together more collectively, at solving the creation and the distribution issues globally with speed.
Why do
So,
you think, and I'm I'm like thinking to your example. It's funny when you showed this slide. The first thing that came to my mind was, yeah, you're right. But where when I tend to see people that kind of buck this trend, it's right when they join a company, right? Like when a new CLO joins, and they usually kind of, level it. They make it a little bit more flat. Um, and it sounds like that's exactly what you did in McDonald's when you came in. You're like, well, why are we not talking to these people? And it's in your effort. So maybe why do you think that is? Why do you think that these organizations that have 11 people doing the same thing, is it that they don't want to step on each other's toes? It's a political thing, it's a ownership thing, or it's just a pure, we just don't know. Like they're just the communication line isn't open. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think it's all the above. I think
Yeah. Okay.
largely it's a reflection of how the organization beyond learning and development actually runs itself.
Right. Right.
Right. So,
Right.
so McDonald's is a simple example. McDonald's France runs itself fairly different than McDonald's UK. And, by design, right, to tailor to the French consumer, to tailor to the British consumer. And so systems and structures and, leadership and all those things are set up at the market level, not at the global level, right? So some person in Chicago can't really think about what's best for a learner in somewhere the south of
Hmm.
France at McDonald's, because it's too far away from what reality is on the ground there and what's going on there,
Yeah.
right? So, but the learning function in France should be able to leverage the entirety of the McDonald's learning ecosystem to solve that problem without having to reinvent the wheel in France. And
Right.
that's really where, speed, scale, agility come into play, because
Mm.
now, I can take best practices done in Australia or some brilliant idea, honestly, by a training coordinator in Australia that can be replicated and scaled across the entire globe, right? Because there's visibility, there's cooperation, there's collaboration, and structurally, it wasn't really centralized. It was more centralized in mind share, where I treated it more like a community because the organization wasn't centralized. So it didn't make sense to run it centralized when the rest of the organization wasn't. But, on an org chart, they rolled up to me. But the reality of it was we focused on these three things around speed, scale, and agility. And that is, how do we solve any problem anywhere without reinventing the wheel? Oftentimes being able to get to an 80% solution with almost no effort in any country because somewhere else had already solved the problem.
Yeah, yeah. It sounds like then, like maybe the biggest factor there really is just that culture of, and I guess I understand, as you are just doing the day, you're focusing in the business versus on the business, right? You're like doing the task, you're creating the events, whatever it is. You get so caught up in what does my team in France need, and like the thought of what does my team in France need has probably been solved by somebody in Germany. Doesn't really cross my mind. Nor, as you said, like if the culture of the org isn't set up. So you bring in this new person who doesn't really, they're not necessarily trying to be one thing or the other. They're just trying to understand where are all of my assets? What do all these people do? They're taking a step back. It frees them up to look at what are those areas of unity, like you mentioned. Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah, I think it's how do you turn all of like in the McDonald's context, it's how do you turn everything else that exists in the system to the advantage of what you're trying to solve locally,
Yeah.
right? And
Yeah. Makes sense.
the only way you get there is with sort of a consolidated view and a consolidated effort, right? To be able to
Hmm.
enable that to happen.
Yep.
And I think that sort of theme applies in any organization, even if you're not particularly global. If you're just in the US, you can, I'm sure you've got East and West Coast, or, when I worked at Singular Wireless, we had, 8 different regions or whatever it was in the
Dang.
US, right? And it was a subset of the same problem,
Yeah.
right? If we're solving something in Arizona, how do we solve that in Boston at the same time? Or when it comes up as an issue in Boston, we already have the Arizona solution. We can turn and pivot, adapt and apply. So around
Hmm.
speed, scale, and agility. So
Yeah.
super
I mean,
important,
yeah,
super
totally
important.
agree.
All right. So let's talk about like why then do you think about managed learning services, which I know Infopro's in the business of doing. So it's not necessarily a sales pitch from my perspective for sure, because I have no vested interest in it. But I think that
Yeah.
there are things that people should be thinking about in the organization in this context when you think about managed learning services. Oftentimes in these fragmented worlds, this is more tactical, but like vendor consolidation is a huge opportunity. I think,
Oh yeah.
you were speaking of Merck, for example. I think Merck identified a couple of years back that they had more than 200 suppliers in the organization of learning content globally, of which about 150 of those were, replicative, meaning duplicates,
Yeah, yeah,
right? People doing the same thing, 14 different leadership development, vendors
yeah.
and, those kind of things. So vendor consolidation provides a huge opportunity in this path through negotiating discounts at an enterprise level and then applying them within the functions and places where
So
they need to be in the organization.
yeah, and just as an aside for those that are new to what managed learning services is really talking about, really it usually boils down to leveraging a single vendor to take on multiple aspects of your learning business, or one aspect end to end. So it could be like we just mentioned, like Rob just mentioned, it could be Merck saying, I want to use one provider for all content, right? That every content is going to route through them from intake to export, whatever it is. Other orgs, might be saying, I want you to take on content development and vendor and facilitation and delivery and LMS admin as well. So managed learning services is really a catch-all for outsourcing a function or the whole like sub functions to an organization.
Yeah, I think that's a helpful example, and I think that these four areas that I put around vendor consolidation, procurement efficiency, resource optimization, technology rationalization are all sort of examples of like highlights that
Yep.
you'll find in a managed learning services pitch deck, right?
Yeah.
In terms of what people will tell you they can bring to the table. But I think what when I was putting this together, one of the things I also thought about, which was really important, was like, why do I want to do that? Why do I want to think about an external partner in terms of helping me run my learning function? One of the advantages I've always saw was this area around access to expertise, right? So if I
Yeah.
hire 40, make this number up and exaggerate to make a point. If I hire 40 e-learning designers, right, today, I'm probably going to get, every time I go to my team for a solution, I'm going to get an e-learning course, even though e-learning might not be the particularly right answer, and through no fault of anybody except myself
Yeah.
for hiring 40 e-learning designers, right? I'm always going to get the same kind of solution and the same dimension of a solution into the organization. So one of the things I really like about managed learning services approach is that I can think beyond that, right? So I can tap into a broader pool of expertise that exists in an MLS provider to look at things like my learning strategy for sure, my technology integration. But on content development, it's like, well, maybe a sim would be better in this situation, not an e-learning course. And your MLS provider probably has those access to those or holds those resources that can build those kind of solutions for you or build you an instructor-led solution or whatever it might be, to sort of design the most appropriate solution for your organization and bring those particular outcomes that you're trying to go for in the business.
Yeah, and I think I don't know. I always feel like I was just talking to somebody who does HR tech rationalization, right? That's what they do. Is you've got a bunch of HR tech to kind of try to streamline it, and he was just really describing. He's like, I feel like the biggest benefit that I bring is just being an external consultant
Sure.
because when I'm having to deal with, we just mentioned you mentioned, your experience at McDonald's, right? Maybe France is using Docebo and China is using Cornerstone, whatever it is. And you're like, well, hey folks, let's make these the same thing here and save ourselves some money. If it works for one, it should work for the other. Well, you have a little bit of a ego to contend with, right? Because whoever
Yeah,
bought it in France liked it for a reason, and China bought it so I always feel like there's also this like I don't know, like sometimes you need someone to break a tie. And
sure.
sometimes you need someone to be the bad guy who's not internally. So I feel like there's also, aside from helping you know what is really best for the job, I also feel like it can help a lot with change management to have somebody who does know your company really well, especially if you do like a managed learning service, because usually they're taking on a big portion of your business. So not only do they know a little bit about your business, but they're also not seen as having a dog in the fight. They're just trying to find the best solution,
Yeah.
which I think employees traditionally are as well. But sometimes the thought that their ego gets in the way slows people down.
Yeah, yeah, or I don't know about that. Or, it's back to the France could make the decision and China could make the decision, right?
Yeah,
And so,
sure.
and as a consequence, they made the decision on based on what they had in mind that they wanted to do.
Yeah,
And my favorite conversation on that is always going back to like email systems and organizations. You don't see in multinational or even multi-divisional organizations, debate over email platforms, right? Because nobody cares whether it's Outlook or Gmail or whatever it is that they use. It's the message and the content that they send that matters,
yeah,
right? And that's always been my conversation about what do we care if it's Docebo or Cornerstone. I mean, honestly, 90% of what they do is all the same anyway.
yeah,
So
yeah.
you're gonna pick your favorite, and France and China, we're gonna pick one. Now let's talk about what you want to do in that system to make
Right.
sure that it can meet your needs to do what you want to do in that system, as opposed to, you know, I like mine, you like yours. We could
Right.
we could
Right.
debate that all day. So it's more about what you want to do. And IT doesn't care what you send an email. Legal
No.
probably does, but IT doesn't care what you
Yeah.
send an email, right? They just say, but it has to happen in Outlook or Exchange or whatever.
Right. Right.
And so so my conversation around learning management systems has always been the same way.
Yeah.
It
Agreed.
doesn't really matter what we want to put in it as long as we know how we want to use it.
Yeah.
Right. So let's not worry about, what courses we can put in it. Let's worry about, does it meet the needs of the organization overall? And
Hmm.
can we use it the way we want to use it,
We want to.
right, in the
Yeah.
organization? And then let's not, belabor whether we need 13 of them. Let's just get one and go from there. But I do think that to your point, managed learning services bring a whole bunch of specialized knowledge and experience. So if you're struggling with those kind of areas, right, they can bring a lot of expertise and
Yeah.
accelerate, really accelerates your thinking in terms of
Yep.
drawing what the right conclusion for you is in any of these particular areas that you're working on,
Yep.
in ways that you probably can't actually do on your own. So. All right. So, and I'm being conscious of time here because we got 11 minutes left. Also, operational efficiency. One of the things that I saw and is true is that outsourcing routine tasks, for example, can really free up your team and the organization to focus on strategic impact. Right. So, sort of before managed learning services, it's like, and there's no science on these numbers, so it's illustrative. 70% of your time is on administrative activities like training coordination, LMS administration, trying to build a report, right? Those kind of things. Whereas after you can free all that up, having a managed learning services provider do a lot of that work and spend more of your time thinking about how are the programs you're running advancing the business? How are they moving things forward? How are they doing those? And I laid down a few examples on the bottom here around some of the simple things that managed learning services providers are really good at doing in the organization. But it's really about getting those things out of the way, the administrative pieces out of the way, so your learning function can position itself more as a business driver.
Yeah. And I had a guy I really admired kind of how he looked at one of these jobs in particular. He said, I'm outsourcing it because I don't have a way to manage this person's career. We have one
Yeah,
LMS admin and we don't have a lot of people in that role. We don't have somebody that she can look up to. And we don't have a career path, honestly, for that person in learning. And so it's while I would like that person to be internal because I feel like it gives me blah blah blah. End of the day, I it's like it solves a short-term problem, but if I look at it in the long term, I'm going to be constantly hiring this person every 2 years because they're going to realize it really is going nowhere. And so yes to all of the things that you said, but I also think, I have this trap myself of, oh, I've got this problem, I can hire this person and get it done. But then if I think of, well, what happens once that's done? Like what happens 2 years from now? I'm like, yeah, that is just a task. Like that task should just go to somebody who can just focus on the task, and I don't have
Yeah.
to train, because if they're not good at the task, who's going to train them to get better?
Yeah. Well, or you've got my favorite question is always like, do you have the best person in the world that could possibly be doing this task for you? And if the
Yeah,
answer, and if the answer is no, then it's like, you're not doing this person a favor,
yeah,
right?
yeah,
So how do you, and then second is, then how do you go and find that best person in the world at it, right? And
yeah,
it's a rhetorical aspirational component to it, but I think your point is right, where in terms of MLS providers can open up more career opportunities for people, because this is sort of, you're doing these things at scale as
yeah,
opposed to a one-off.
yeah,
And it does make it more possible for people to have a good and storied career around those things.
yeah,
The other, which is, this one is my favorite, around flexibility and scalability. And my conversation with my CFO is always around, fixed capacity versus variable capacity, right? Which I had called elastic capacity here, which is, my CFOs, the CFOs that I've always worked for have always loved the notion of around elastic capacity, right? And so how do you keep fixed capacity as low as possible? And then elastic capacity as elastic as possible, right? And the idea here is basically that, back to sort of business impact and strategic alignment of learning and development's efforts on things that are driving the business forward. If you're aligning your efforts against what the business is working on, 9 times out of 10, those things are what you would consider elastic, meaning they're finite, right? So we're doing I don't know, a financial systems transformation in our business, right? And it's going to take place over the next 18 months. And I need to fund resources from the L&D function to be able to make sure people know how to use these systems, perform these tasks in these systems. Uh, Probably in your fixed bucket today, those resources don't exist. So how do you then flex your resources to be able to get what you need to be able to solve that particular solution in the organization? It's much easier to go in and say, I need, I'm making a number up, $250,000 worth of resources, however you want to
yep,
define that in terms of people or project or a vendor, that I can add into the scope of my L&D functional activities to be able to address this 18-month issue that's going to come. And then at the end of 18 months, I'm going to turn it off, right? And so having things that are finite, more transactional in nature, is much more appealing to the finance part of the organization than fixed capacity, which means I need to hire 4 more people to solve this particular problem in the organization, and there's no end in sight when that's ever going to go away. And I do think that's a dimension of every organization. So, for example, new hire onboarding is pretty much a constant in almost every organization. So that's sort of where you need fixed capacity. So we know we're going to hire 250 people this year, 20 people a month. We know we're going to be running a program. We know these things are like run the railroad activities for us. That's where you can really focus your fixed capacity efforts on. But it also might be that you're looking at in content creation, I'm going to put fixed capacity on people who are sort of architects around the learning. And then I'm going to lean into my MLS provider on an elastic capacity basis to then sort of build to the blueprint that I've created to serve whatever function of the organization that whatever part of the organization is that I support. So this notion around fixed and elastic is really important idea, and super valuable when you start talking to senior executives about when you say you think of the learning function that way, they start shaking their head saying yes.
Yeah, I
Because
mean, and the organizations that we've helped shift to that type of model, right? We call it on demand, but it's kind of the same thing, fixed and on demand. I feel like it simplifies it. It's tough to kind of implement the first, like wrap your head around it and design your org. But like once it's designed, I feel like orgs, especially L&D leaders, really appreciate a model like that because the elastic part of demand usually is paid for by the department that is needing it. And that's their desire, right? They're like, hey, I want my function to be these people. And then when the business says, I need you to launch this financial services training platform, I want to be able to say, fine, it's $150,000, and I'll just go find, to go to my vendor and say, hey, it's 150 grand. I've got that approved, versus mapping out at the start of the year my, $1 million budget, and then the day one somebody comes to me with a problem that doesn't really fit inside that box. So
yeah,
I feel like people, once they implement it, I think they like really reap the rewards of it.
it definitely gives you more flexibility in your conversations around budgets.
Yeah.
And two, organizational priorities always get funded, or they wouldn't
Yeah.
be organizational priorities. And oftentimes we're a subset of an organizational priority. We're a vehicle towards achieving an organizational priority. And if you're positioned, the investment required in training or learning or whatever it might be in the context of that organizational priority, you almost always get funding. And
Yep.
it doesn't matter, and I'll say it, it's recorded. It doesn't matter whether your company is doing well or not. Every organization has strategic priorities and will invest in those priorities, even when the business itself is in a downturn, right? That's what turnaround plans are and those
Yep.
kind of things, right? Investments are being made to turn the business around, for example. And the question is, are you part of that? And do you have the elasticity in your budget model to be able to rise to that demand? And I think this is when you have this kind of mindset and you work this kind of angle, this is when you don't get into conversations about getting your budget cut.
Yep.
You talk less about it because you might have $3 million this year and $1.5 million next year. And that's okay because that's the elastic capacity and or the
You're right.
elasticity that your business is facing anyway. So
Yep.
you don't lose sleep over getting your budget cut. You actually
Absolutely.
expect it and live that way. So we're
So
getting close on time. So
we're coming close. We
we're
might have
getting
to
really
skip.
close, but I think this is my last one is really just around, there's a lot of governance benefits. There's a lot of data visibility benefits that you really need
Totally.
to think about. And this whole single point of accountability piece as well, with the managed learning services provider, that are worth thinking about when thinking about managed learning services and the reason why consolidation really matters these days, in terms of what's going on. So these are the takeaways. I talked about a lot of these, and we're a little short on time, so I'm not going to rehash them. But the imperative for change was part one here, and then the advantage to thinking about managed learning services is also here. But I would tell you that I think probably almost 30 years into the managed learning services model out there, and having experienced it across 4 different companies, it's a pretty proven path at this point, that most organizations really already are intentionally or unintentionally thinking about, but you should be if you're not, is what I would say. So I'm going to stop sharing at this point, and it should bring me back. Here we go.
Yeah, we're
And we'll
back.
wrap it up here, Nolan.
Yeah, well, thanks, Rob, and thanks everybody for sticking around for the conversation. I hope it was apt, kind of around this budget planning cycle, and I know everybody's looking at next year and what do they want their teams to look like. So, hope we provided some good insight for all of you. I posted our LinkedIn details there to connect with Rob, connect with myself. Would love to talk with either of you one on one if you have a follow up. I know that we're kind of at time now, but we will send this recording and we'll be in touch. But again, don't hesitate to reach out to either one of us. Love to talk about this topic.
Yeah, happy to help.
All right. Thanks,
Thanks.
everyone. Enjoy the rest of your day.